And now I'd like to welcome Soraya Membreno to the stage. Soraya recently joined INN as our Chief Operating Officer.
Hi, can you hear me any better now?
That's so much better. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay.
So what were you saying? We were just talking about the fact that, sustainability is more than just about cash in the door.
Yeah, I was saying that the other part of that puzzle is your people. And I think particularly in nonprofits, especially in those early days, it's not uncommon to find that you've built entire structures and workflows around like a specific person. And so as a publisher, I was constantly asking like, who are those Jenga pieces in the organization? Can the structure hold if this person goes on leave or that person wins the lottery? And as we see more and more nonprofit newsrooms springing up, we're also going to see more new and first-time founders. And the reality is that as wild as it sounds and non-urgent as it sounds, it's really never too early to start thinking about how are you as a founder going to evolve with your organization as it matures? How are you going to know when it's time to pass the torch? How do you take the trust and the energy that you've built up in creating this thing and transfer it over to that next generation of nonprofit news leaders?
Exactly. We get this question a lot from members as they're thinking about, how to transition and grow their organization. And so that's really why we wanted to bring this conversation to the stage with CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, Evan Smith, and the organization's new editor-in-chief, Sewell Chan, because they really know what it's like. So I'd like to invite them to the stage. And Soraya, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Barney. Welcome, Evan, Sewell. Thank you so much for joining us on day one of INN Days.
Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Soraya. Thank you.
Yes. For folks meeting you for the first time, very quick micro bio. Evan Smith is the CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, a pioneering nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news organization serving the state of Texas since its launch in 2009. This past October, Sewell Chan joined the Texas Tribune as editor-in-chief. And earlier this year, Evan announced that 2022 would be his last year as CEO. So just to set the stage, I'd like to start with a few questions for you, Evan.
Sure.
So, Evan, you're, of course, CEO of the Texas Tribune, but you're also the co-founder. So tell us a little bit about what spurred you to start a nonprofit news organization, right, and about the dynamic of being a founding leader of an organization in particular.
Well, first of all, thanks so much to you, Soraya, and thanks to INN for having us today. It's exciting to get to be with you, and I'm very happy to talk about this. I feel like I talk about it every day. If we were not on camera, I'd still be talking about it. It's the what happens when you announce that you're getting ready to leave. People have a lot of questions, and I think the thing to know is I am as proud of the organization today as I've ever been. I love this place and believe in this place every bit as much in the 13th year as I did on day one or even on day zero. You're talking about the time before we started the Tribune. I was running a magazine called Texas Monthly. I believed in the mission of that for-profit general interest magazine, loved my colleagues, loved the work that we did. But I was increasingly concerned that the number of reporters at news organizations in the state covering politics and policy was dropping precipitously. I believe as we calculated it in 2009, when I was getting ready to leave Texas Monthly to start the Tribune, the number of reporters had dropped to a third of what it had been when I arrived in Texas to work at Texas Monthly in 1991. The Houston Post, which was the second of two big city newspapers in the city of Houston, was gone by then, long gone. The Dallas Times-Herald was long gone. The San Antonio Express was long gone. There were just fewer places to get reliable, credible news, and there were fewer people to report it, and I wanted to be part of a solution. And so when a venture capitalist in Austin, John Thornton, who has been really I think undervalued and underappreciated in terms of what he's contributed to the nonprofit journalism space the last decade plus. When he came to me and said, I've got this idea that we can try to create a new model for journalism, I took some time to think about it, but I was really convinced from the very beginning that we needed to do this. There was no guarantee that we'd succeed, Soraya. But one of the great things about the nonprofit news space that I've seen over the last 13 years is we are not risk averse as some of our legacy brothers and sisters are. We are willing to take chances, knowing that we might fail, but you don't accomplish anything great unless you try and unless you're willing to take chances. And so we took a chance at the beginning that this thing would work. And I'm excited to say 13 years later, this is a really high functioning organization that has accomplished so much more than any of us, and I would say including and especially me, had a right to expect.
Yeah, I think we can definitely say that that the Texas Tribune has worked and is working. Data. So we have data from last year's INN index, which is a massive research undertaking that INN does every year. And
Right.
It showed that the local sector of nonprofit news is growing rapidly at an average of about one launch per month for each of the past 3 years. And likewise, the number of state nonprofit newsrooms has been growing steadily since 2011. So all that to say, we're going to have quite a few founding leaders in INN member newsrooms,
Yep.
And increasingly so. And we're going to get into the logistics of transition in a second, but first I'd love to hear more about your internal thought process, because you've talked about how there isn't necessarily a plan for your post-Texas Tribune life yet, just that you knew that this was the right time. So how did you know that this year was the year? Are there any cues in like your day-to-day work that signaled to you like, hey, it's time to start thinking seriously about this?
Well, as I said, Soraya, when I announced I was going to step down, sentimentality and nostalgia are the enemies of progress at an organization like this. If you're so completely consumed as I am as the founder, co-founder, by the origin story of this organization, by the stories of the early days, and by the way we've always done things, you become not intending to be a barrier to change and growth and evolution. And every organization has got to continue to change and grow, evolve and progress. And so I want to be sure that by staying in this job, not one day longer than I should, this organization has the means to become the thing that it needs to be in its next 13 years. And I just think you've got to be unselfish as the person running this place in recognizing that by staying longer than your usefulness, that ultimately you're keeping the organization and its people back. You're holding it back from becoming the organization it wants to be. Somebody who's going to come in next is going to be different from me by definition. They'll be able to do things I can't do, and they'll have another spin on the founding vision, and they'll be able to take this place to accomplish new things, places that I probably would not have been able to do. For me, that was one thing. A second thing is I wanted the organization to be in the best shape it had ever been in. So I was handing off a performing asset to the next person. I didn't want to hand off a flaming bag of anything to the next person. And in fact, this place has got more members than it's ever had in its history, the biggest audience it's had, has the most money in the bank it's ever had, has raised the most money to date, of course, in its history, and more than any of us imagined we would be able to. And most important, our journalism is the best it's ever been. We've known that in a kind of general sense, but over the last 3 weeks, our coverage of the Uvalde shooting has been, I think, an extraordinarily high point, maybe the highest point in our 13-year history. And the person who led that effort was Sewell Chan, our editor-in-chief. And having Sewell here, to me, was kind of the great capstone on these many things that needed to be checked off as boxes for me in deciding to step away. We have the best editor-in-chief we've ever had. We have the person who is in the absolute best position to lead this organization journalistically we've ever had. I have the most confidence I've ever had in anybody as a partner in Sewell. And so for me, having the right future leader of this organization in place was a precondition to leaving. And so I think for everybody, it's a different set of calculations. But for me, I needed to be sure that this thing I love so much, going back to being a founder, that I sometimes refer to as my third child, sometimes my best behaved child and sometimes my worst behaved child. I wanted to be sure that this thing was ready to leave the nest, as it were, and be led by others. And Sewell is the ideal partner to have as far as that goes.
Yeah, I mean, ready on a high note before you shake things out. Sewell, next question is geared more to you. So as we said, you came to the Texas Tribune in late 2021 as the new editor-in-chief. But I want to backtrack for just a second. I've heard you speak a bit about vision statements and how you push back a little bit on this idea of a new leader coming in with some grandiose vision for a workplace that they haven't even really met yet. So can you talk a bit about the process of joining an organization like the Texas Tribune, which has such a firm identity and sense of purpose as an organization already, and the process of building a vision over time as a new incoming leader?
Yeah, thanks, Soraya. That's a great question. Just a little bit of context about me. I'd been working in newspapers for, close to 22 years before I joined the Texas Tribune. Each newspaper that I worked for had been founded in the 19th century. And now, of course, I'm working for a nonprofit newsroom that was founded in 2009. And yet the similarities might actually be a lot more surprising and striking than would appear from the outside. Every kind of organization, including, I'm sure, each INN member represented in this conference, has its own kind of organizational culture and mission. And the goal of leadership is to kind of nurture and improve that organizational culture and mission over time. But I think, the first step is understand, where have we been? Because if you don't understand where we've been, it's hard to chart a path to where we need to go. And so, of course, I wrote memos, and of course, I studied very, very deeply as I was preparing to be interviewed for this job and considered for this job. But truthfully, one thing that really sold me was being interviewed by employees who are already here. And that was a part of our process. It wasn't just Evan's decision, although it was mostly Evan, ultimately Evan's decision. But really, Evan brought in several panels of employees, senior executives, news editors, and yes, reporters and frontline news gatherers. And I had a chance to talk with them and see if they could, get bought in on someone like me who had not lived in Texas before and, would face a very, very steep learning curve. So I think that, part of leadership is, look, leadership's changing too, right? If we're being really honest, the age of like the very hard charging, leader, where everything is a little bit top down. If we're being really frank, that's leadership style is probably not quite as consistent with what our employees want these days, right? We're looking for leaders who are listeners. We're looking for leaders who are ultimately collaborators in chief, in my view, and who can get people from different disciplines and different backgrounds, different generations, certainly different demographic, backgrounds as well, to really collaborate together in a shared spirit of enterprise. And so, coming into this place, I had totally absorbed our strategic plan, which I think is a wonderful document. We're thinking about what the next strategic plan will look like already. And, but I really came in, with a clear sense of mission and a determination to help, build the vision that we all collectively share.
And Soraya, I would just jump in and say that what Sewell talked about, the importance of not leading as a top-down manager, but understanding that this generation of employees is looking for something different, and especially coming out of the last 2+ years, which have been, let's be honest, years in hell. We were consciously looking for a healer. We were looking for somebody who was going to come in and have a deft touch, be as empathetic and understanding and compassionate to the colleagues he has as possible. And Sewell has been all that and more. In fact, that was his brand heading in the door, was that he is an extremely empathetic person. He has a firm hand of a leader, but he also is a great listener, and he's somebody who is concerned about the well-being of the people around him. And again, we like other news organizations have been through the ringer over the last couple of years. And it was great to have somebody come in who would be responsive to what the staff needed in view of that. I think at a different time, we might have made a different choice. I don't think so, because Sewell to me seems like the perfect person. But in terms of the skill set that we were looking for, Sewell arrived just exactly at the right moment. It was prominence.
Yeah. And it speaks to the organization's change, and what they need changes along with that. Those are not static things. And I think, Sewell, your collaborator in chief, like that I think you're really, really touching on something there. To kind of follow up that same train of thought, you were able to, and this is kind of a question for both of you together. Evan, I know that you were able to give Sewell a little bit of a heads up that your decision was coming throughout that process. And so, Sewell, how did that change your approach to this first year on the job, kind of knowing that was on the horizon? Or how did you both broach that conversation.
Well, Evan, and I had probably hours of discussion about the Texas Tribune even before I kind of formally applied. Then I formally applied and I came into Austin, and met with staff members. It was then, Evan, if I'm not mistaken, that you pulled me aside and let me know of your own plans to retire as CEO at the end of this year. I remember being quite taken aback at first. I was like, "Oh my gosh, how is this possible? How is this organization going to keep running?" But the more conversations that we had, Evan, the more I felt assured that while risky, you could say in some ways, coming into this job actually seemed like a no-brainer. You have built an organization that I believe is resilient and robust. And the asset test is going to be now, right? Like, can this institution survive its founding generation? And Ross Ramsey, another beloved co-founder who was a political columnist for many years and then was interim editor-in-chief before me, he retired a couple months ago. And the loss is felt so acutely. I mean, I'm literally standing in Ross's office right now thinking, why am I here? Ross should be here. And so, there's definitely some very human parts of this that, Evan's departure is going to, shake this place in ways that I can't even anticipate yet. Evan's departure also means that, we now have the obligation to rewrite the next story of the Texas Tribune's chapter. And ultimately, I believe that institutions, what makes them institutions is that they're bigger than any one of us, right? And I'm ultimately, and I know this is old-fashioned in saying this, but I'm an institutionalist ultimately. Not because I think institutions always get it right, but I think institutions help organize, human activity. And if you have got institutions that have good values and have a good track record, they're places that people are proud to be associated with. And I'm thinking about all the INN members on this call, no matter when you were founded. Obviously, we have nonprofit newsrooms that are 50 years old in America, and we have a great many that have been founded just within the last few years. But I'm sure all of the leaders on this call are thinking about, how do I develop, I don't want to call it a brand because that sounds so marketing oriented, but I do mean, how do we make sure that our newsrooms are places that people feel proud to be associated with, and for the right reasons. And in thinking about the Tribune, I just felt such a sense of pride even before setting foot here. And so while I knew it was going to be very daunting and challenging, I also was like, look, let's do this. Let's jam. I'm going to have a year to work with Evan, and I'm trying every day to learn as much as I can from that year. Keeping it confidential from the staff was probably part of the hard part, right? I mean, Evan told me this before I started in October, obviously, and I think his announcement wasn't until January. So when Evan, you can take up this part here.
Oh, well, I'm just listening to all this. I mean, it's great to hear your telling of the story. Look, I remember being with Sewell and letting him in on my news. It was my Gap band moment. I dropped a bomb on you, is how I thought about it. And how Sewell reacted was in some ways the ultimate test of whether he would be successful in this job, because he was very calm about it, and I could see him processing it. Sewell's the kind of person who, when you're talking to him, is 3 or 4 places ahead on the game board of where most other people are. He's already taking the information, turning it over in his mind, and thinking about what happens next and next and next. And I was so impressed with the way that he saw, okay, I've been thrown a curve here, but this is also an enormous opportunity for the organization and for me in the role I'm in. Sewell is also kind of a poly-perfect. He's the best student imaginable, like front row of the classroom, always ready to learn. And so Sewell understood that part of the decision that I made to leave would impact him by requiring him to become the absolute best student of this organization's history. And just as Sewell got to Texas and is immediately going to things and meeting people who I, in 31 years here, have never met, like he's already made himself a presence in the community and has recognized the importance of getting integrated into all these conversations and all these organizations. Sewell took it upon himself immediately to absorb like a sponge every aspect of the things that preceded him so that he would be prepared to go forward. And I think, there was never going to be a question in my mind, Soraya, of whether the new editor-in-chief would have a heads up about this before, because, the alternative was for me to hire Sewell, and then the minute he got here, say, "Psych, I'm leaving."
Yeah.
That would have been pretty terrible of me to do, right? I mean, I think we as an organization are big.
I still would have stayed, Evan.
Well, I don't want to know about that. I mean, I don't want to think about rewriting that history. Look, we as news organizations are about transparency and honesty, disclosure, right? I think that we have to hold ourselves to the same standard that we hold the people we cover to. And so in this case, transparency was a requirement heading in the door for Sewell, for me to let him or anybody in that position know. Look, let me say something else, and this does get to the overall theme of this conversation, which is transition. We made the decision, my board, our board, and me, I'm the one employee of the board, we made the decision to make this announcement in January at the very beginning of a year in which I would remain as CEO while the search proceeded, knowing that I would not be out of the job for perhaps as much as 11 months. And the reason is we wanted this to be an orderly transition, not one conducted in under cover of darkness, where it was skulking around to try to find the new person, hoping that the news didn't break. We wanted the organization, because we do believe, as Sewell talked about, when he interviewed for the job, he talked to employees at all levels of the company. We believe that this organization is best when everybody from top to bottom is brought to the table, is brought in on major things affecting us. So we thought it was really important for the organization to have that much time to process the information, the news, and then be part of the conversations about what would come next. And indeed, the staff has been brought in, has been interviewed. People have been part of the process and will be more part of the process as candidates start to come through here. So I would suggest to any organization that is contemplating a transition like the one we're going through, one of the most important things you can do is give people time to take in the information and give the organization time to deal with what the implications of this are going to be. And I think we're going to be significantly better and healthier as an organization when that person arrives in October or November of this year and I cycle out as CEO, for having had this year to literally transition. And Sewell is going to be a major component.
Evan wrote a really heartfelt note in January, which is really an extraordinary note, I feel. I don't think I've ever seen a leader write such a note. Evan said that he felt that he had founder syndrome of a kind, meaning that, like many founders, that he knew that it was time to hand over the torch. Now, Evan is, I can disclose, a pretty young man still and has a lot of years left in his career. Evan could easily be here, 20 more years if he wanted to. I'd be thrilled to continue working with Evan for multiple more years. That's what I had hoped going into this job application, right? But I think part of Evan's humility and wisdom was saying that and it's something that probably a lot of us on this call feel, right? How do you succeed a dynamic and charismatic founder? What if you are that dynamic and charismatic founder, or one of them, right? Friends asked me, well, Sewell, if you're going to join a new nonprofit newsroom, why not found one? And I was like, what are you talking about? That would be insanely stressful. I would so much rather join an institution that's already been succeeding and help it get to even new heights. But I'm never going to be a founder, right? I'm going to be someone who took a house that Evan and Ross and Emily Ramshaw and others have built, and John Thornton and others, many others, and help add, my floor or my wing to that house, and then leave it in even stronger shape for the next person. And that actually, the prospect of doing that really filled me with joy, and still does. And so, although obviously I would have, probably if I had my druthers, I would have been like, I want to work with Evan at least 5 more years. But I saw where he was going with this. And I actually saw that as being an incredible sign of maturity and also confidence. Evan would not have walked away, would not be retiring, and he's not fully retiring. He's on contract with us next year to work with events and other strategic priorities and fundraising. But Evan would not be retiring as CEO if he were not confident that the people here had the talent, the ability, the resilience to carry this forward. And that's the part that excites me so much.
Yeah, and you've touched a little on sort of the nitty-gritty details of like what is succession planning, because it's kind of, this big all-encompassing term. And some of that is really just being able to work so far in advance that it's informing your hiring decisions, it's bringing in your board. When I was the publisher of Bitch Media through a couple of leadership transitions, and something that our EIC and I talked about often was this idea of, the 1.0 version of the organization moving into the 2.0 version and assessing where we were already in that 2.0 mindset versus where we were still, had some work to do to get out of that 1.0. And so what sorts of, as you have this year-long length of time to make these moves, what sort of internal markers are you looking out for to gauge whether this is working or when you're done transitioning?
I'll jump in and say that for me, because in some ways there's two transitions happening simultaneously. There's the one where I'm slowly stepping away and a new person once hired will step in. But, Sewell's been here for barely 8 months in the job. Sewell is in some ways still in this process of transitioning in. And so I'm judging in some ways both transitions, essentially, dual screens in front of me. The quality of the journalism and the ability for the newsroom to see Sewell's vision put into practice is, for me, the biggest marker of that transition, the EIC transition. And again, I'll call out our reporting on Uvalde, which I'll put up against anybody's in the country in terms of its principle and purpose, its compassion, and its granular knowledge of the conditions on the ground, the community impacted, the lives of the people impacted. Sewell has led that. The hard work of our reporters, editors, photographers, and the entire staff has obviously been reflected in the work that we've published, but there's leadership at the top of that, and that's his. And to me, I judge, for me, the thing to judge is whether it's working or not. And I think that we are accomplishing the things that we need to accomplish consistent with our mission and are providing people with something that, but for us, would not exist. In my case, I think the important thing that the board understands, the search firm we retained understands, and those of us in leadership here understand, is that the next CEO will not be me, and that is in fact exactly how it ought to be. The next person will not be a clone of me, will not do the things that I've done, will not do the job the way that I've done them. It's absolutely critical that the next person have skills that I don't have and defines the job differently. And, any transition at the top is a transition at the layer down from the top, because the people on the senior leadership team are going to have to do their jobs differently based on who the person is we bring in as the CEO, to solve for some of the things that person can't do, but to also to accept the fact that person may approach the task of running this place differently. It's not really just a transition at the top, it's a company-wide, organization-wide transition.
Absolutely.
And I think we have, by the way, not just in Sewell, but in the other senior leaders of this organization, people who are comfortable enough with the idea that change is coming, that we're going to be okay.
This actually tees up my next question really nicely, which is that I don't think we can talk about transition without talking about transition fatigue and what that can mean for staff and how leadership approaches supporting staff through what, even in the most well-planned process, will always feel a little bit like uncertainty on the staff side. And so how are you all thinking about that kind of staff support pre-fatigue component in all of the various decisions throughout this process?
So, well, having been, I'm remembering my many years as a non-manager before I became a manager, and I think the fatigue is highest when there's a sense that leadership isn't talking with each other, isn't on the same page, is sending conflicting or mixed messages, doesn't have clarity. I'm a big believer that, leadership these days is about teams. And so I'm on a senior management team. I'm on Evan's senior management team alongside our CFO and head of revenue. head of development, head of comms, chief product officer, and we row really closely together. And then I, in turn, have my newsroom leadership team, and we all try to row together. And I think the key is that the staff, look, a really wise boss told me that, getting a new boss, like moving houses, like moving to a new home, is always traumatic. And I thought that at first I was like, that's kind of dramatic, but it is kind of always traumatic, even if it's a home that you're really thrilled about moving into, and even if it's a boss that you're really thrilled about having, which may or may not be the case for my staff. But the point is that, who we work with, the context that we're in is always a big part of affecting our well-being, right? And so I think as leaders, one of the things we have to do is to say that although the leaders are new, the values, the mission, the purpose, the goals, the organizational culture, that's what endures. And I really don't mean that in kind of a softy way. I mean, I literally tried my first few months here to begin every question. Every time I was asked a hard question, I wouldn't dodge, but I'd probably ask for context. Well, how have we done it before? What do you recommend? But look, it's a fine balance, right? People don't want leaders who have zero opinions. I mean, I definitely, I think, have emerged with certain points of view or certain things I'd like us to do better. But the point is that those opinions have to come after you've consulted and collaborated, after you've listened to, well, what are the pain points? After you've heard the different perspectives in the room. Some might want to go in this direction, faster versus slower is always one, right? And we think about that a lot. We're not, set up to be like a CNN type newsroom. We have also had, that said, to work as fast as ever on hugely competitive news stories. That's just one example. Another one is how much to focus on, daily news versus longer form enterprise, right? We started off as really a publication that kind of tried to stay away from covering breaking news too much, and really tried to deliver on the impactful enterprise that would really, be revelatory and original. And again, that's a balance as well. And usually the answer to anything that's like a balance between two things that are good, the answer is really never one or the other, right? The answer is, how do we find the right balance? How do we find the equilibrium that makes sense for our organization? So I hope that by talking about these questions clearly and the trade-offs involved in any decision, right? Whether you have a staff of 2,000 or a staff of 20, you got to make trade-offs about how to spend take the most precious asset, which is the time and talent of our staff. The talent is limitless. The time is not. And so as managers, right, how do we use that time and be open about that? So I think those are some of the ways to lessen transition leadership fatigue. I actually think that, the transition fatigue doesn't have to be so fatiguing if in fact people feel like, wow, there are things happening now, and my voice is included and I'm being heard along with my colleagues.
And I would also say, Soraya, that one of the ways to avoid transition fatigue is for it not to seem like there's a transition going on every minute of the day. As CEO, I am not winding down in a way that is visible to anybody in the staff. I am going to run through the tape. I'm working at 150% of my capacity and will continue to until the very last minute of the very last day that I'm CEO. And so if it's not the case that it looks like I'm moving boxes out of my office 3 months before I'm actually done being CEO, hopefully the staff can keep its time and bandwidth directed to doing the work that we're here to do, because at the end of the day, this is about the work. And I don't want anybody to be thinking, well, God, he's Xing off days like Clint Eastwood in Escape from Alcatraz. Well, how many more days does he have as CEO? I actually want people not to be thinking about the fact that I'm leaving until the day that I'm leaving. I'm going to work as hard as I can so that they think we have a CEO. He's raising money. He's carrying the flag of the brand, and all is as it's always been.
Yeah, no, that's great. We are nearing the end of our time already. So I want to open the conversation up to questions from our audience. I'd be interested to hear more about how Evan and Sewell work together in your respective roles. What does that look like?
Well, let me jump in and say that I'm looking for someone who I know is as committed to the mission of this organization as possible in the role of editor-in-chief. And Sewell has demonstrated in his first 8 months an absolute bear hug embrace of our mission. There's not a day when I don't think Sewell understands why we're here or what we're here to do. And Sewell and I are in constant conversation, morning, news, and night, about things big and small that we need to be working on together, or areas in which he needs my support as CEO, and he knows he has it. But we also have an honest relationship. Yeah. Sewell will ask me for things, and I will say to him, this I can do, this I might be able to do, this I cannot do. We have to have that level of trust between one another, where he knows his job is to ask for support, and where I can give it, I can give it. But where I can't give it, I've got to tell him I can't give it, and here's why. This is not middle school field day. Everybody gets a ribbon, everybody gets celebrated and rewarded for everything. No, we've got to be honest with one another about, picking winners and losers in terms of the priorities of this organization at any given time. So the most important thing, Christopher, I'd say about a working relationship between the editor-in-chief and the CEO of an organization like this is constant communication and complete transparency and honesty. I trust Sewell after 8 months as much as I've trusted anybody I've worked with. And I think that's great.
I'm really touched by that. And, I'll add some specifics so this doesn't just seem like a love fest, although I do feel my trust in Evan is 100%. And look, as editor-in-chief, I am the one to advance usually the case for more resources. I also have worked with enough business side executives that I trust. And I wouldn't say Evan's a business side executive. Evan's actually a fascinating hybrid, because he is a journalist, has been a journalist, was an editor-in-chief, but also really understands, what it takes to keep the organization's lights on. But I have to be mindful every time I ask for more resources. Well, where is this coming out of? Where is their give? And I think my knowing the budget, my talking to our CFO, I have to have an awareness of ultimately, I want us to grow for sure. I also want us to grow sustainably. I don't want us to be adding a lot of people and then laying off people. Like, that is not the Texas Tribune way. And so, I've had to kind of moderate some of my ambitions at times. Like, I'd love a newsroom that's twice as large as it is right now. But I know that for that to happen, it would have to be a very carefully managed staged growth that will take years, right? And the good news is that under Evan's leadership, this place has grown from, I think, 16 or 17 journalists to more than 50. And we have done that sustainably and with a good business operations and very sound management. And so I really want to continue on that path. In terms of getting to work with someone extremely closely, it's always different, right? I mean, I learned early on that Evan's super a morning person. I tend to be a little bit more of a night person. We are talking frequently. I would say we probably talk at least once a day. Sometimes it's over Slack, sometimes phone, sometimes text. But the key is trust, and also being aware of each other's, other commitments in life too, which I try very hard to be. When Evan's on vacation, I really try not to bother him at all. And Evan in turn has been very respectful of my time. I'm not away that much, but he's known, for example, when Soraya and I were at this CUNY executive leadership training together, which was a really, really wonderful program. Evan was really good about giving me the time to focus on my professional development and learn from fellow leaders, including Soraya. So I think that's a big part of that trust relationship as well.
Yeah. We have another question from Sam. How do you think about all the external stakeholders affected by leadership change when thinking about the transition?
Well, this is one of the reasons, Soraya, and to Sam, that we made the call to come out with this news a year or so in advance of when my last day as CEO would be, because I have a lot of relationships with people who support the Tribune at different levels across the state. And I want to spend as much time as I can preparing those people for what comes next. Asking them to not only support us this year, but and this is actually something that we made the decision early on. I credit our Chief Development Officer, Terry Quinn, with having this idea, that we've gone to our donors and said, support us this year, but also commit to supporting us 2 additional years so that the new CEO has some runway to get his or her feet under him or her, get acclimated to the job, get acclimated to the organization, get acclimated, if necessary, to the state. And then I'm going to take over the next year. Sewell alluded to my continuing relationship with the Tribune as an advisor to the CEO through the end of 2023. I'm going to take the new CEO around to meet a bunch of people over the course of the next 12 months. We cannot forget the external stakeholders. I mean, there's different external stakeholders. There's readers, there's event attendees, there's donors, there's foundation supporters, there's corporate sponsors, and everybody needs a little something in this. We have to be careful that that we don't turn the lights out, when they're still in the room. They've got to feel like they're with us, and that we have to consider them as steps that have to be taken, part of the steps that have to be taken as this change happens. So I think it's a great question. And we were very careful in the announcement to make sure that we had an order of people who needed to be notified about this at the same time that the staff did. Like, the sequencing is critical. From the very beginning, when you let people know that this change is going to happen, all the way through the day that is the day of change. There's an enormous amount of intentionality that has to happen, because these people are part of the extended Texas Tribune family, and they need to be treated as such.
Yeah. We have a curveball question. I think what both you and Evan and Sewell are both modeling here is obviously a process that has had tons of thought and care put into it. But we have a question from Ginny. Ginny's asking, your situation is one where the CEO founder is actively engaged in succession. How do you manage a process where founding leadership is resistant to leaving?
That may be a better question for some board chairs, but Evan, I'll let you handle that one.
I mean, look, I think, you put the organization first, whoever you is, whichever the organization is, you got to put the organization first. This is not a vanity play. This is about the mission, and this is about the totality of the operation, including the people and the readership and the community and democracy. I mean, I look at this as an obligation on the part of founders to know when it's time to go. And I also think that you have to listen to others if you don't know that it's time to go, but they do. So I don't have any experience at having to remove anybody from the top of a place, because, I got it before everybody else did. So I don't know that I have a real life example to give you. Yeah. But we've all known. Here's what I'll say. We've all known people who have stayed in jobs too long and didn't know it. We've also known people who stayed in jobs too long and did know it and stayed anyway. And I just think that the very best thing you can do as a leader is not to be one of those two people, but to be conscious of what's around you. And so hopefully this is not a situation where you've got to, drag the person out by a rope or by a hook.
And we're going to squeeze in one more really quickly in this last minute. We have a question from Michaela. Coming into the org, Sewell, how will you think about your own eventual transition out and your successor in the future? When will you know the right time?
Well, that's really a great question. Obviously I'm in my first year in the job. I'm expecting to be here quite a while and have made a commitment to doing so. That said, I will add that I think one thing that a leader at any level needs to think about is, who is the bench? What is the team? Who are the potential people who can rise and could do this job someday? And to make sure that that team is as inclusive and diverse as possible. I am very proud to be helping to steward the Tribune. I also know that my stewardship will ultimately, be, temporary, in the sense that it's unlikely it's going to be decades, right? And I probably wouldn't want it to be decades. I've worked in a whole bunch of different organizations. I think a lot of editors-in-chief, if you make it to 5 or 8 years, that's a long time. But I think the ones I've admired the most are who they were thinking from day one, or at least thinking very early on about who might come next, right? Because I'm ultimately going to be judged, I feel, as a newsroom leader, not just by what I accomplished during my tenure, like in terms of the work, but in terms of who is empowered. How do we well, first of all, everyone should be empowered in terms of skills and abilities, but also specifically, what is the next generation of journalists to lead nonprofit newsrooms or found them? How can we make sure that, that all the goals that we have tried to set out as an industry and unfortunately failed in so many cases to meet, how can we change that narrative? How do we make sure that, people of color, but especially Latino and African-American perspectives that have too often gone unheard or less listened to, even in newsrooms, separate from the fact of Black and Latino communities and their news being represented, how do we cultivate the next generation of diverse leaders so that power, it's about power, right? It's about, I usually talk about empowerment, but ultimately it is in part about power. It's like, who do we, hand over the keys to ultimately to really take this to the next level? And I feel as a diverse leader, as someone who's been very, very fortunate in my career, I'm the first, I'm diverse in several ways, GLBT, child of immigrants, first gen, but I feel that my job is to try to open up pathways and opportunities for all of our journalists, including, I hope, the people who may someday be succeeding me or succeeding or rising into the most senior roles in newsroom management.
Yeah. I think that's quite a note to leave on. We're at time, but Sewell, Evan, thank you so much
Thanks, Soraya,
for joining us today.